arrive at certain conclusions that will be different from the guys. So question is, what is option A for? If you go to the books and the literature, they will tell you that open ballot system is a voting method in which voters vote openly, in contrast to a secret ballot system, where voters' choices are confidential. So as it relates to competition under this option, voters queue behind a candidate of their choice as the person's or the person's photo. I think one of the things, if you look at option A4, there are several angles to it. But in popular conversations, people will always focus on queuing behind the photo. But if you look at it realistically, as also Professor Irenia mentioned, it also involves other things that announcing the result on immediately the election was completed. Also was concluded. But in their own time, there's another system to it, which was that in your own primaries, you start from your ward, move to your local government, get to your state before coming to the national. All those components come together to constitute what they call the option A4. So let me also say that Professor Wosu was not the originator of what is popularly known as the open ballot system. Some other countries of the world have traditional open ballots. They have had that. In Australia, for example, open ballot system was in use in 1856 when the country adopted the secret ballot system. In the United Kingdom, it was the Ballot Act of 1872 that officially introduced secret ballots to the British parliamentary system. In Belgium, it was in 1877 that they embraced secret ballots. Even in Nigeria, it was open ballot system reigned until 1923 when the British colonial administrators introduced secret ballots. A related question then would be, why did Professor Wosu try to establish, embrace the open ballot system at a time most of the world had moved away from that system? So my own answer was that as a political scientist, he started from analyzing the character of electoral competition in the country. He knew that virtually every electoral outcome has been contested. And he felt that as a political scientist, he understands the anarchic character of electoral competition. And that electoral competition is anarchic, not just the system that makes it anarchic, because of the character of the post-colonial state itself, where the state of political power is often seen as the means of production, distribution, and exchange. If you hold political power, you have the power to turn a pauper to a billionaire, and a billionaire to a pauper. And in national electoral competition, there is always a pervasive fear that those that capture political power will use such political power to privilege their in-group and, underprivilege the others. They are local phenomena. So in that sense, electoral competition tends to be towards what we call the Hobbesian state of nature. I think Professor Wosu knew, as a political scientist, that there is very little, there's not much he can do to change the character of the post-colonial state. But he also believes that by bringing in a system that is a little more open, where everybody will see it, that he can do something, it will be a way to attenuate the anarchic character of the system. He also believes that it is possible to domesticate, a system that was borrowed, that you can domesticate. And I'll give you an instance where I believe he did this. He said something like, when he tried to defend a modified option L4, remember that after he was the critic the open ballot system, Erika had already talked about, they came up with a modified, where of course, instead of now going to queue behind everybody, you still do all that process, but now you can vote, secretly. When he was critiqued for embracing a system that was almost anachronistic. His defense was this. He said in an interview he granted to the news magazine in 2008, he said, there is nothing wrong, I must say, with the secret ballot system per se, but it has been thoroughly abused in this country, starting from the federal elections in 1964, October 1965 Western House of Assembly elections, 1979 and 1983. Why should we continue to use what didn't work? It works for Britain. No one will go and stop elections in Britain. No one will go and write the results before it is released. Nigerians should begin to ask questions about systems that work, not mentioning theories, transparent this and electronic that. Nigerians want something that is real, that can restore confidence and that their choice is respected. Let me say that one of the reasons Professor Wosu had this confidence to embrace a system that people will ordinarily laugh at you. He has been a commissioner, local government, he has been a commissioner for agriculture, he has had practical experience, and therefore has been able to marry theory with praxis. And that makes that once you see maybe an academic who had gone into the system and embraced the system and seen how the system works, applied his theories and see the limitations of theory, he often comes to a different person. That is, the person that doesn't become an ex-intellectual. Okay, now let me talk about briefly, the June 12 election. The political environment, which is often one of the things people do not pay attention to. What is the political environment under which he operated? The first thing to know is that he was transitioning to liberal democracy and facilitating at the same time demilitarization. It was a time of conversations for the ability to disengage. Remember under the dispensation from 1999, if you are an electoral empire, you are confined to dealing with the political class. And dealing with the political class alone is a wahala. In the case of Professor Wosu, they had two bogus power blocks. You had the military bloc and you had the political class. And within the military bloc, if you read Babangida's autobiography recently, released in February, within the military bloc, there is a big faction that didn't want the election to go on. So what will happen? It is bad enough that once, because of the character of electoral competition, anyone that has won electoral chief umpire is rare that you can come out. In fact, it doesn't happen that you come out with your reputation intact. I normally tell Professor Jaga, you're very lucky because Jonathan considered defeat. If you didn't, you'd just be like the rest of them. Okay, so that environment of two contending forces, the political force, and then even within those two forces are sub-forces, and the Association of Better Nigerians, those also being played at the agenda. Is an environment that was unique to June 12. So, demilitarization, what people don't understand is that it is a very difficult thing for demilitarization. If you want first to transfer power to the civilian, you first of all have to professionalize the soldiers. And most of them had eaten the forbidden fruit of political power. So once you want now to disengage them, you politicize them the more. They become more politically active. So that was the context and the environment under which Professor Wosu found himself. So, what are the contending forces within the military? Babangida in his book narrated how his government's credibility deficit was compounded by several events. He mentioned the Association of Better Nigeria. So let me just take a small quote here. Because what was, if you read Babangida's book, in between the lines, what was very clear was that even before the June 12, Babangida had lost control of the government. There was a faction, that force that didn't want election to hold had become ascendant. And several quotes from that book will just portray this. For example, he said, in page 272 of that book, he said, unknown to me at this time, Justice Pepe, who was relatively young at the bench, had worked in the chambers of Attorney General and Minister of Justice Clement Akpampo. Strangely, Justice Ibeme, in the dead of the night, in clear violation of Decree 13, which barred any court from interfering with NEC's conduct or scheduling of the elections, granted ADN an injunction stopping NEC from conducting June elections. There was confusion everywhere. I quickly convened an emergency meeting of NDSC for the next day to discuss the way forward. On Friday, June 11, as the NDSC meeting was going on, I learned, again, this is the head of state president, I learned that the Lagos High Court had ruled that NEC should go ahead with the election. So he was completely, being sidelined. He had lost control. So Babangida narrated again other incidents. So from that you move now to, if you're a political scientist, to discuss what we call the locus of power. If you go to any environment, one of the things you look for is where does the locus of power lie. It may not be with the formal authority. There is always the power behind the throne. And Professor also understands that at that time the locus of power has shifted. So from that point, from all evidence in the literature available on that, he started to play mind game with them. So, just to summarize this, one of the things that Babangida said, he said on the morning of June 23, he said on June 16th, now that's about the annulment, without my knowledge or prior approval, NEC chairman Professor Wosu announced the suspension of June 12 election until further notice. I knew instantly that certain fifth columnists were at work and that there was a need for extra care. I emphasized need for extra care. And even after that suspension of the announcement of results, APN obtained another strange court order from Justice Saleh's court in Abuja, stopping the release of the results. One of the reasons for making this point is that when some people start saying that Professor Bruce was a coward and could have announced, that was what Oshiomhole said, and I just said, oh, probably, that's enough to say. But the fact that if you read both Wosu's account, the interview he granted the news in 2008, Babangida's account, it became very clear that from that moment, Professor Wosu started to play mind games with them, and I'll give you an example. So he said, playing mind games with them, it would seem that it became obvious that Professor Wosu, once it became obvious that he had lost control, all he had to do was to find a way. One of the ones was that after that judgment, after the first court tried to stop them, and Wosu said he could go on, that was the first time tweeting them, and the election went on. So the second one, so I said that out-tweeting them, that was in round one. He also out-tweeted them in round two by ensuring that the conduct of the election was heat-free, as violence could have provided the forces that did not want the election to go ahead, with the ammunition, the excuse to intervene, and cancel the exercise, or even topple the Babangida government. So, if you read Babangida, he said, voting took place in all the 110,000 polling stations in the country, and in keeping with the modified open ballot system, as stipulated in Decree 13, counting took place flawlessly in the open, followed almost simultaneously with an open collation that allowed for final results to be attained quickly. Wosu also tweeted that function of the military by announcing the results. People said he didn't announce the result, but that's not true. I think what they were trying to say that he did not declare Abiola the president. Did he announce the result? Yes, he did. I said he announced the result contrary to some suggestion that he failed to announce. But what is the announce? Now, quoting Babangida again, he said, using a giant board, and that's Professor Reya said that, using a giant board in front of his Abuja offices, INEC started as early as June 13, as stipulated by the electoral law, to display already released results from all 30 states headquarters of NEC. Now my emphasis, before the resident electoral commissioners brought them to Abuja for final ratification. That's emphasis. That process of public display of results, which had now covered 14 states, continued until June 14. And then on June 16, Again, he said, quoting again, without my knowledge or prior approval, the process was suspended. So then I posed the question, was Professor Wosu hero or villain in the matter of June 12th? So I have, apart from Nigerians claim that Wosu should have gone ahead to announce results, and to that extent that he did not, and to the extent that he did not declare Abiola the winner of the election, was a coward, as former Edo State Governor Adams Shomole claimed. English people will say that the situation is a better part of valor. Babangida, a military general who was the head of state, said he suspected lead columnists in the annulment, and to quote him, he realized he needed to tread very carefully. The Igbos say that it is from the compound of an apparent coward that people stay and point at the ruins in the compound of a man of bravado, not bravery. It takes wisdom to know that there is a difference between bravery and bravado. So the truth is that if Mosu had not gone ahead to release the results, he quote, even before the resident electoral commissioners brought them to Abuja, that's what he did, before they brought them to Abuja, we would probably not be talking about Abiola winning that election today. By releasing the results of the election the way he did, despite knowing that the forces that did not want the election to hold had become ascendant, Professor Wosu actually informed the world that Abiola had won, and by so doing, outwitted that faction of the military yet again. Why he was not in a position to declare Abiola president-elect, because not all results had been released, and the court in Abuja, working with those shadowy forces, had obtained another court order stopping the release of the results. Professor Wosu believed he had done his bit by letting the world know who was winning the elections, and that it was then up to Nigerians to help Abiola claim his mandates. Professor Wosu's genius in the game of wits between him and the faction of the military that did not want the elections to hold at all was to let Nigerians know who won the election before allowing the military to annul it. In essence, a faction of the military annulled the election, but it was like bolting the stable after the horse had already bolted. By outwitting that faction of the military yet again, Professor Wosu successfully turned it into a confrontation between progressive Nigerians and that wing of the military that did not want the election to hold. Now, what did Professor Wosu think of June 12th? In an interview he granted, let me just summarize, 10 years before June 12th was made the Democracy Day. In an interview he granted the news, he called June 12th a movement and said that June 12th was superior to May 29th being Democracy Day. In fact, called for June 12th to be made Democracy Day. And that only was realized 10 years after he made that call. So now I come to the third glimpse. I said I will tell a little of the story of as I understood it, to the option A4 and then June 12th, and that's where I will then summarize my work. How do I tie it all together? Is to look at the future of option A4 and the ballot system, and then before interrogating some of the claims that were made. So some of the supporters of option A4 or open ballot system have given reasons. They said it enhances transparency, accountability, engagement, easier to verify, social pressure, and the rest. And of course, critics believe that worry about voter intimidation, coercion, and even outright harm on individuals who vote for certain candidates. Now, it is very common for us, and that's why I'm going to disappoint so many people here. It's very common to say that the June 12th election was the fairest and freest. So given the clamor in some quarters for the open ballot system to be brought back, I think that's when the clamor that you had the freest and fairest election under option A4 or open ballot system. And as Professor Iradia was recounting, He recounted all the elections before and after, none was friction-free, except option one. So the whole idea became, let's bring it back. And that's why I do some interrogations. So, what's one of the questions I will ask? Are those clamoring for it merely ensnared by nostalgia, the good old days syndrome, in which the past is always romanticized or perceived as better than the present? Are the proponents of the idea part of the group that unwittingly believes that there must exist somewhere a magic bullet or a magic elixir or an alchemy that once you apply it, it will be the desideratum or the magic that will solve all the problems we have with our elections? So my first question, is, one is that what we call the danger of elevating the institutional manifestations of a phenomenon to its defining characteristics. If you say the June 12th was the freest and fairest because it was conducted under option A4, have they been able to establish a cause and effect? Can you say that because presumably it was the freest and fairest, it was because it was conducted up from A4? So the cause and effect has not been established, because you can also argue, if it was the freest and fairest because it was conducted under option A4, was it also because it was conducted under option A4 that it was annulled? So was the June 12th election free and fair because of option A4? Or is it because of other factors? For example, the fear of the military. People were tired, the political class were cautious. You have seen so many that were disqualified, and people could even be arrested. So that was also a restraining factor. People wanted also the military to go back to the barrack. That could be a restraining factor. And then the fact that you had a popular candidate. I have a table in this paper that show that not only was Tofa defeated in Kano, in Anambra State, where Chief Odumegwu comes from, where most of us Igbos are voting in highest, he lost Anambra State. Abiola won Anambra State. In the other 4 Igbo states, Abiola won by razor margin, 51%, 48%. So in total, all he was able to win, and that was despite the fact that an Igbo, Sylvester, was the running mate to Tofa in the National Republican Government. So there are several factors that who have contributed to what people perceive to be why the election was free and fair, and that it is to be unfair to ascribe all to the fact. I wanted to do a brief something on Professor Mosu, but I think Professor Mosu was my lecturer. We entered the uni at the same time, and he was one of the lecturers, not exactly too popular as I said, because he was fixing the lectures very early in the morning, 7 a.m. We also call him usual lecturer. He had a Mercedes, and but you can't remove the force of his presence. And let me briefly now summarize by saying, what is the best way to immortalize Professor Mosu? I have a lot of respect for Senator Inaugural Adibe, but I disagree with him and his colleagues in the Senate who walked out because the Senate refused to endorse a motion to honor Professor Mosu posthumously on several grounds. One, I'm not sure it was proper to bring that motion in the floor of the Senate as it amounted to begging the state to honor him. The mere fact of begging reduces the quality and the glamour of it all. If I had to beg you to give me money, I think that quality is reduced. The second is that even if Professor Mosu is honored posthumously, one could raise the question of the worth of a few letters after your name, or naming a building after the person, especially now that national honors, as Professor Redia said, have become very cheapened. The best place to immortalize anyone is in people's hearts. There are better ways of immortalizing Professor Mosu and I gave some instances that since he was a professor of public administration, those in institutions like that will name buildings after him. some of the papers that were delivered during the colloquia, and even this one, you could put it together and put out a nice book that will live forever. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Adibe. MC, I think your job is done, eh? Yes. I figure we will get through.